All right, welcome everybody. We are going to get started and kick off our 1 o'clock session, engaging the community in Cleveland's park investments. Very excited to have you here, and I'm joined by some great speakers. We are going to just go over a couple quick items around some housekeeping. First and foremost, we want to thank our host, Cleveland Public Library, for giving us the ability to use the Hop-In platform for this session. Additionally, we are just want to point out a couple things to help make your view a little bit better. So you can click on these 3 buttons here to pin a screen, especially helpful when we are doing some of the PowerPoints. You'll be able to see those a little bit better. You can also minimize your chat and poll areas in order to enlarge the screen. We're going to ask, we have a few sort of interactive questions at the end for our audience. We ask you to use the chat box to put any comments or questions that you may have for us. If we have time and we're able to make it work, we may even bring you on camera to help with that. One other thing I want to point out, we do have a couple poll questions here in our session. If you want to take a look at those, we just kind of want to know who's in the audience and maybe how you use our parks. So please, when you get a second, feel free to take a look at there and provide some info if you feel so inclined. And then finally, I just want to invite all of you to engage with us either on social, on the web. If you are posting anything about the summit, please use the hashtag #SustainableCLE. With that, I want to kick things off. And again, just bear with me for 1 second while I pull up my screen. All righty. Let's do this really quick. Hopefully everyone can see this all right. So I am kicking things off here, and then I'm going to turn it over to David Jerka from Seventh Hill Design, and I'm also joined by Sean Terry from the Trust for Public Land. We've been working together for golly, it's going on about 2 years now, working on our commitment to a 10-minute, having all of our residents have access to a 10-minute walk to a clean, safe park. Just a quick overview of what we're going to be covering. Let's see here. How do I... Oh, all right. I apologize for some of the presentation issues, but hopefully it'll make it a little bit easier just for me to navigate through these. Some of the things that we're going to be covering today are an overall introduction and background, giving you just some context of kind of how we got here and what we're hoping to accomplish as part of this overall project. Additionally, David is going to cover some of the best practices and engagement recommendations that his team has helped cultivate, and that ultimately we're going to be kind of refining as we work through some of this. Finally, I'm going to invite Sean to give us a little bit of info on the Trust for Public Land and just some of the work that they've been doing. They've been a really great partner throughout all of this process, and would just very excited to hear from them. And then finally, again, based on kind of how much time we have left, questions for either our presenters, or also we have some questions for you that we can kind of dive into. I'm going to try to keep my piece as brief as possible because we do want to hear from you as much as we can. So some just quick background on our 10-minute walk goal, and really just, kind of all of our park investment as a whole. Cleveland has over 150 parks, public parks, and green space and little pocket parks. So we're really in an interesting position right now where we can be more strategic in how we're investing in those parks, but also how we're engaging the community in those investments to make sure that they feel truly engaged in the process, and that really the park is going to meet their needs as they go through that. I think just to back it up a little, I want to talk about kind of how we got here. As we were working through the development of the Climate Action Plan in 2017, the Mayor Jackson signed on to the national 10-minute walk goal. And, I think there were a lot of connections to the climate action goals, and especially the emphasis on equity as we had through this most recent update. So there was a lot of alignment, and it made a lot of sense for us to commit to that, especially as we were working through that process. Our Clean Water and Vibrant Green Space focus area has a number of objectives that touch on this and are related, including improving our access for residents. As I mentioned, the mayor had signed on to our 10-minute walk campaign. Really, I think what's important here is recognizing the benefits of access to parks, and especially, the health benefits that our residents can see as a result of having some of that access. I think one of the things that we like to point out, Cleveland is just about 85%. I think the most recent numbers were about 83, which is significantly higher than the national average, 55%. So, while we're doing great, especially for an urbanized area, that does present some challenges because we are somewhat limited in our ability to create new park spaces. It's not to say it can't happen, but we'll have to be much more strategic. So, some of the work that we've been doing most recently to help support this is in securing a National Parks and Recreation Association grant. Back at the end of 2019, they were very flexible with us to extend the grant through September of this year because they recognize some of the challenges the awardees were facing as a result of the COVID pandemic. A lot of our initial plan for this grant was to do some really, on the ground in the parks community engagement. And unfortunately, COVID had a different plan for us. So, we've been much more strategic, and we're going to get into some of that later in the presentations on how we engage with residents when we actually can't be with them. TPL, and I don't want to give too many spoilers, they created a really cool activity book that I think was a really creative solution. And I've been excited to share it kind of with some of my national partners as we go along. So moving along, I just want to highlight, kind of what we're looking at for our Cleveland parks. You can see, we have pretty good coverage, but we do have some priority areas that need some attention, including, if you look here, kind of that Clark Fulton neighborhood. And we're going to talk about some projects that are happening there a little bit later. Just want to share our project team. We were fortunate enough to contract with Seventh Hill, and he brought in Roberta Duarte and Clifford Herring, who are, I think really helping us to get strategic in how we approach some of this. And you'll see some of that in some of the examples that we share. Overall, our project goal for this is to, make sure that we're understanding where in our capital investment process we can start to plug in community engagement and make sure that our residents' voices are heard a lot earlier in the process, rather than sort of at the tail end once sort of the park's been designed. And it gets challenging to incorporate resident feedback, especially when, we have limited budgets and how much we can spend. We've created an advisory group that's been able to help us strategically understand, what are the different concerns at all of the different levels, from the residents and users, the folks that are programming the park, to even the folks that are maintaining the park and have to, kind of do some of that outside of the normal park users. So we're also looking to, create a menu of strategies that can help us as we work through this journey, so that we have sort of in our back pocket a number of ways that we can engage right off the bat as soon as we know a park is slotted for capital funding. As I mentioned, Clark Avenue Park is hopefully going to be one of those pilot projects that we can really start to test some of these, and I think is going to provide us a unique opportunity to learn a lot that can be applied throughout all of our park investments kind of moving forward. Overall, our project timeline, we're hoping to kind of wrap things up and have our final sort of report and implementation guide by the end of the year. We've gotten already a draft menu of strategies, which has been great. We've engaged with our advisory group a few times. We do have an online survey that we've sent out to try to get some of that stakeholder feedback. So overall, it's chugging along, and I'm hopeful that in early 2022 we'll have, a better strategy of how we start to do some of that implementation and, excuse me, start to institutionalize some of these practices as we go along. I mentioned the advisory group. It's made up of a number of folks that are representing a lot of different stakeholders at different levels, from city departments, parks, programming organizations, you name it. In one of our first meetings, we did work with them to establish our guiding principles for this project. And you can see here, I think it addresses equity, but also, really making sure that our residents feel that they are part of the process, and building some transparency and trust, so that as we work through this, they feel like they are being brought along and not, not an afterthought. It's funny, actually, in our training for this NRPA grant, a few of us were fortunate enough to go and engage with some of the other cities, and one of the presenters had shared a slide that said, if you bring me on early, I'm your partner. If you bring me on later, I'm your judge. And I think that really exemplifies, what we're trying to shift away from and shift to, where our residents feel more like they're a partner in this, and then ultimately you're going to get the most value out of those parks as we continue to build and improve them. So with that, I want to turn it over to David, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. Britt, can I ask you to mute me and turn my camera off, only because of my mode? And David, I'll let you take it away. If you want to just say next slide when you're ready, I'll move them along.
Great. Thanks, Kristin. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. I'm going to go through briefly some of the initial ideas that we're pulling together. And we kind of consider this an early draft so that there's significant room for additions. So within these two sections that I'll cover, best practices and engagement recommendations, we envision that we have significantly more content to add to it. So this is an opportunity to just share some of the first kind of like initial ideas with all of you. So with that, you can go on to the next slide. So basically in this section with best practices, that means we're looking at what are some tools and bigger frameworks that have been used in Cleveland, but also in other cities that could potentially be applied here in Cleveland for parks planning in the future. And we've organized these best practices in 5 categories. So the first is public participation framework. So this is, big picture, how do you think about public participation? Number 2 is sampling plans. That basically means how do you select or identify community members that ought to be engaged in a process? How do you know who the users are? Number 3, engagement tools. So these are specific methods and tactics to effectively conduct outreach and gather these key insights that are required to develop and implement parks, including the programming after the park is built. 4th, we thought it's important to include specific best practices regarding accessibility and making sure that the process includes all voices and a range of needs of users, as well as bilingual outreach communications, knowing that we have community members that speak a range of languages in Cleveland. And then lastly, post-occupancy evaluations. So this means after the park is built, how do we evaluate that it's actually working and that's being used, and then identifying potential tweaks or adjustments after a project is built. Okay, so with that being said, we'll jump into some examples from each of these categories. Next slide. So the first, I think we'll get the next slide up here in a second. Great. So the first is one public participation framework. This is from IAP2, or the International Association for Public Participation. They identify 5 different stages or degrees along the spectrum of participation, from informing on one end all the way to empowering on the other end. And I think it's important to understand this larger framework as we make decisions about engagement actions, recognizing that different tools might be useful at different stages along the process, and that there's different levels of depth available for residents to be a part of the process. Next. This is an idea from the Cleveland Public Library, and it involves recognizing that places like parks and libraries function at different levels for the user experience, from the physical building to the outdoor spaces, how the surrounding neighborhood's designed so that people can get access to that place, but then also services, which in the case of the parks might be digital access. So finding out a schedule of when activities are happening, that's an important part of the overall design of a place. So we want to be mindful of, one, the lack of access that many Cleveland residents have to internet, and what are the plans to expand that access, but also recognizing that there needs to be ways of communicating with folks who may not have internet access, so you can't rely on that completely. Next, and I'm going to go through some of these a little bit quicker, and then if there's questions about them later, I'm happy to talk about them. So this next one's just an example of how you can identify the number of residents within a community, looking at census tract data, and particularly identifying broadband access and the languages that people speak in the surrounding area. Next. And with that data, looking at a chart or an Excel spreadsheet might not be the most intuitive or user-friendly way to understand that data. So we are also looking at an example here that our project partner Ben worked on, which was visualizing Cleveland data in ways that are more graphic and visual. So you create these sort of infographics about racial and age distribution across the city. Next. This is an example that we used on a project called 25 Connects, which involved creating personas of different users. So this can be a helpful way of taking that kind of numerical data from a spreadsheet and making it more relatable and understandable to not only the designers, but also the community members that will use that data to inform their decisions. Next. This is an example of a tool that's used in Hillsboro, Oregon. And this is essentially a series of signage that's physical, as well as an online application that allows passersby and users of a park to provide their feedback real time through multiple means, either through their mobile phone or on a website, or by their phone by calling a number and leaving comments. So this is a potential tool that could be used before a project started to gather feedback on what's working and what's not working in a current park, but also during and after the process to collect feedback in a way that's more accessible. Next. This is also from 25 Connects, and basically the tool here is mobile tours. The idea is to have walks with residents in the place that we're planning to design and gather their ideas for what's working, what's not working, and then pull that information into the design process so that it's more responsive. And this is something that often works a lot better than just asking people to answer a survey at home. But rather being in that space that we're planning to design together, residents often have more specific and detailed feedback that's really useful in the design process. Next. A public comment chalkboard. This is a project that was developed by Gresham Smith in Florida. So it's the idea of potentially having a physical board in the space where people can leave their feedback either during an event or at all times, and whenever they're available, whenever they have time, they can leave comments on that physical place rather than using a digital platform for feedback. Next. This is a project from Elevate the East, which involved getting really in-depth feedback from individuals through the use of something called the user experience walk. So this is kind of similar to the mobile tours, but instead of having a group of people walking together, this is one person at a time, where you video and audio record that person talking out loud everything that they think and feel as they're walking that corridor. If you go to the next slide, based on that data that then you look at the video after the walk is over, you can go back to your office and actually transcribe what people have said at different points along the walk, and then this ultimately creates what you call a user journey map, where you can visually identify the high points and low points of that overall experience. And then a point that might need design support is identified as like a key negative. And it's, again, a way of taking qualitative data, like the comments that people make that are sometimes hard to kind of visualize and really do something with, but then allows you to kind of put it into a structure, a framework that then is actionable through the design process. Next. This is an idea from James Rojas, and this involves hands-on design workshops. So in his case, he works often with Latino community members and finds that a tactile environment for the public meeting allows more people to participate. And it's more intuitive for some. There's different kinds of learners, and some prefer to maybe use their hands and kind of visualize and feel their way through a design idea rather than either verbalizing it or writing it down. Next. This is an example of a workshop we did with Slavic Village, where we were working on designing future vacant lots. And part of this process, similar to example with the James Rojas project, was creating cutouts of pieces that are one-to-one, like actual scale of the map that's used, so that residents can quickly work together to generate 1, 2, 3 different options for that green space together and get a better sense of scale. That's often one of the challenges when we work on designing projects together, is just getting your head around how big is a space, what actually fits on it. So by using this hands-on method, it allows more people to participate and feel confident in their design decisions. Next. This is the example that Kristin mentioned earlier, which is developed by Recess Clee, Trust for Public Land, the city, and Art Exlove, where they created this really cool, fun, engaging coloring book that more than a coloring book, I guess it's more of like an activity book. Coloring is one part of it, where youth can get involved in the design process of envisioning their future rec center or green space or park. So this is another great example of like how we can engage youth in the design process. Next. So this is one of the examples of bilingual engagement. So again, this is for the 25 Connects project. We created 2 websites and various engagement activities that were specific to the Spanish-speaking population, and then in English as well. So rather than creating one website that relies on like Google to translate it, which often doesn't do that great of a job, we created 2 different websites, and one entirely in Spanish where it was translated accurately. And we found that through the process, kind of holding that throughout the project by having events that were in Spanish, we got really great participation from the Spanish-speaking community in Clark Fulton. Next. Also thinking about residents who have, certain needs in terms of using a wheelchair or impaired vision, we want to make sure that all community members can participate in the design process. So in this example, it was a mobility tour, but invited participants who were affiliated with Maximum Accessible Housing of Ohio. And from this tour together, we got some very detailed feedback on what are the challenges that they encounter when they're walking down the sidewalk or walking down the West 25th Street corridor. And next slide. And some of those, including, this gentleman who's visually impaired, gave us some really specific details that are actionable for design to make his experience walking the corridor feel safer, and he feels more confident, traveling on his own. Next. So kind of wrapping up the examples here, this is a great one called Happy City. It's actually from Mexico City, where the team worked with individuals in the community to conduct intercept surveys and ask passersby and users of the park for their feedback while they were in the park space. And it really focused on their quality of life. What are their concerns? What are their safety issues? So the idea is that there might be these kind of more interactive ways to get feedback from people who are using the parks, rather than simply inviting them to some public meeting where they may not feel interested in going to it, or they don't really have a lot of experience going to public meetings. This is a way to capture the feedback from all residents. And then lastly is the idea of like a park ambassador program. This is from Oakland, California, where they have the Oakland Volunteer Park Patrol. And these individuals are trained, and you find them in the park, and they're ready to help people if they have questions or concerns, or kind of unsure about what to do in a park environment. They have ambassadors there who are really dedicated to that place, and are really knowledge experts about that location. So it's a way of bringing in more residents and individuals into the process, even after the park is built. Okay, so in terms of engagement recommendations, we started looking at what are some opportunities for engagement in this overall timeline of park design and development. So one of the first things we did was look at what's the current process of parks development. So basically it has this multi-stage process within the city where there's first a parks assessment that's conducted, I believe, like on a 3-year cycle. And then the assessment kind of identifies which are the parks that are most in need of upkeep or maintenance and needs. And then that goes into a process to identify funding through the capital plan. And then once that capital funding is approved, then that can trigger the design process. And that design process can take like 8 to 12 months or sometimes longer. And at the end of that design, about at the end, then you have a groundbreaking. And the groundbreaking is the start of construction. And after construction, of course, the park gets opened. And then importantly, we want to look at after the park is open, there's still programming that needs to happen in order to make sure that people use the space and they use it in a way that they want. So what this slide shows is opportunities for public involvement throughout this multi-step process. So starting at the very beginning, we're looking at what are the ways that more residents and potential users of the park could be involved in the assessment of those parks. Next, getting community input in that capital planning process. Next, during the design process, of course, neighborhood outreach, letting people know that the design process is started so that they can participate in it. Then looking at potentially co-design workshops using some of the examples we showed you before. And then even in that process, let's say 75% of the budget is identified for things that are critical and needed to get done. But if there's there's oftentimes additional funds that can be used in one way or another. So is that an opportunity for participatory budgeting in ways that more residents can be involved in understanding what are the trade-offs, and given a certain amount of money, how would you use that funding? What are the specific needs that you'd like to have addressed in that park? And then moving forward, after the design is developed, during construction, there's opportunities to keep people engaged. Obviously progress updates so that people are informed, like how the construction is going, when it'll be ready, but then also maybe things like site tours so that, residents of all ages can get an inside look at how this happens, how this process happens. Maybe it turns on, young resident into the construction trades, for example. And then lastly, after the park is open, the Park Ambassador program could help identify how people are using the park. Are there needs that are missing? Are people using the park in the way that was expected or not? And then kind of create a friendly environment in these park locations. Okay, so I'll go through these a little bit quickly here at the end, but other recommendations are, kind of broadly for this project, for this process, like how do you build trust? So that's an important piece in understanding what are the ways that accountability can be built in the program, reliability, and transparency throughout the work. Next. And another thing that we heard was really important is the need for partnership. There's already community organizations and local groups that are really focused on parks planning. So what are the ways that the city can be better engaged and communicate with different community organizations? And so I want to give a shout out here to NeighborUp's Parks and Public Space Innovation team. There's one example. We participated in one of their workshops that they had recently. And, there's a lot of people throughout the city that are very, they care a lot about their parks. So it seems like an opportunity to leverage that and just bring more people into the process from the very beginning. Next, creating feedback loops in the planning process. So this means coming back to the community multiple times as the design is developing so that we're building the plan together. Next, create frameworks to evaluate a range of engagement tools. So the idea is that there's so many options here for engagement. There's many different tools, from hands-on workshops that we showed you. There's online platforms. You could even build one-to-one scale prototypes before the final version's built. but we have to understand like what tools are the right for that job, you know. So you can look at these options in terms of cost versus how immersive these tools are. And then this is a framework that can help, you know, the city and partners kind of decide what are the right engagement tools for each of the planning projects. And then lastly, we want to make sure we're identifying the right engagement method to match the different residents that we want to engage. So you can think of this like connecting different engagement methods that I just showed you on the previous slide with attributes of the personas that are developed for that neighborhood. And for example, if someone speaks Spanish, what are the appropriate tools to engage them? If someone has limited mobility or lack of internet access, what are the engagement tools and methods that we're using to make sure we ultimately reach everyone and have everybody involved in the project that wants to be involved? All right, so that's it for my part. Now I'm going to hand it off to Sean now.
Thanks, David. Appreciate that. And good afternoon, everyone. First off, I just want to extend my thanks again to the City of Cleveland and Kristin and the Office of Sustainability for inviting the Trust for Public Land to participate in this year's summit. Next slide. Thanks. Again, I'm Sean Cherry with the Trust for Public Land. I manage our Parks for People program. And for those unfamiliar with our work, the Trust for Public Land is a national nonprofit leader in green spaces. And our mission at its core is to build parks and protect land for people to ensure equitable access to nature and a healthy quality of life for all. Next slide, please. Historically, TPL's impact in Ohio has been sort of skewed toward land protection. But as Kristin mentioned, beginning in 2017, we began working closely with the city to unpack some of the apparent park equity gaps across the city. So for the Trust for Public Land and adding universal park equity to our Ohio mission, we understood that disrupting the status quo was critical. In order to really make an impact, not only do we have to bring investment to areas that have suffered from lack of investment, but we also have to develop a more transparent and inclusive dialogue with community in order to really achieve that sort of creativity in park design, that diversity in park amenities, and that cultural relevance that all parks need. And I think you see a lot of that desire around embedding that two-way dialogue sort of built into the thinking around some of the strategies for stronger community input as highlighted here by David. So to start, we asked why parks matter in Cleveland, and grounding our pursuit around park equity, we really leaned in on the 10-minute walk campaign, which is a national effort led by TPL to ensure that all residents have access to a functional park space within a 10-minute walk. And then in 2018, we sort of took the next step to that, getting a little bit more granular around our approach and assessment. And we developed Advancing Park Equity in Cleveland as cornerstone research that identifies the top locations where park equity is most imbalanced. And you see here the neighborhoods that we've highlighted in West Boulevard, Clark Fulton, Union Mills, Cam's Corner, and Old Brooklyn. For folks who actually attended last year's session, you may recall me talking a lot about that history of collaboration between TPL and the city. And the work that the 10-minute walk team has done around determining park investments. And so obviously these are our target communities, but for the purposes of piloting some of these efforts, we'll focus on park equity and investment in Clark Fulton. Next slide, please. So doubling down on equity. Since 2018, when we released the Cleveland Park equity data, TPL has, since that time as an organization, become more responsive to equity. And we've doubled down on this focus by incorporating equity as an independent fifth metric in Park Score, which is the assessment that we use to calculate national park ranking for the top 100 cities. You may recall last year, Cleveland was ranked 29th. Shout out to Cleveland and all of the hard work that we've done around access. We've actually risen 5 slots this year and now sit at 24th overall. So we've made some tremendous strides, but still a lot to do, a lot of work to do, and a lot of great opportunities here to really move the needle on engagement. Next slide. This time last year, we were semi-optimistic on the likelihood of being able to invest in a future park in our pilot community in Clark Fulton. Naturally, a lot of that hesitance, I think, was related to COVID and the fact that we had some challenges around aligning stakeholders and having some of those early conversations, as well as some of the delays tied at the federal and state level around the announcement on park funding. And that we had targeted for addressing that gap, but just really didn't know where we stood. But fast forward to 2021, and this past August, we were really pleased to learn that Cleveland was selected as a recipient for funding from the National Park Service's Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership Grant, which was drafted and developed by the city and supported by TPL. This funding, which is roughly in the amount of $661,000, will provide funds needed to initiate formal planning for a future Clark Avenue Park, starting with community engagement and conceptual design. And just to be clear, that amount won't cover the entire cost of park construction, but it's a significant shot in the arm, which is going to allow us to leverage other funding streams to make investment happen and hopefully see shovels in the ground within the next 2 to 3 years. Additionally, I'll just add that this location is really uniquely positioned to become a park space that allows the city to be extremely creative with design and integration, given its proximity to two other public-facing spaces, that being the Clark Rec Center and Clark Elementary School, which are both slated for improvements and both offer sort of programmable space for recreation. So we have an opportunity with the future Clark Avenue Park to really address low-hanging fruit, but then also some of that more aspirate desire that we often hear, but aren't necessarily in a position to pursue. Since we'll have two nearby complementary assets that, for instance, both offer basketball hoops, we can maybe avoid some of the redundancy and provide or address maybe some of those more atypical amenity selections that we hear and would love to be able to provide in a future park space. Next slide. So you heard a little bit about the Parks Unlimited activity book. We have a ton to learn and apply thanks to the process recommendations outlined by David and Seventh Hill. But this Parks Unlimited activity book is something that really excites me. We have the opportunity to reprise this as a resource. Last year, we distributed roughly 1,000 copies of the book. And since that time, we've learned a little bit. We learned what's effective in a resource like this. Maybe less content is better in some instances. But we also know that a resource like this has the opportunity to really bring some cultural relevance and sort of highlight that as a critical component to park design. And so we're really excited about the Center Bifold, which is the Create Your Dream Playground. This will really give us an opportunity again to hear from the voices that often get under valued, if you will, in community processes, that being the youth. Let's hear from them. Let's see what motivates them to be in a park space, and then let's try to bring that to light in the future investment. So I want to leave time for ample Q&A, so I'll end here. But here's my information. Happy to share a little bit more about our project perspective on this and some of the other great work that we're doing both here in Cleveland and as a national organization. So thank you.
So awesome. Thank you so much, guys. And thank you all for bearing with me. That was, I don't think the preferred view that I wanted to share that in, but I am not on my own computer, so I am adapting as much as possible. So give me just one quick second while I pull up our board. I think one of the big things that we wanted to use the rest of our time for is first going through any questions that we have from the audience. I'm taking a quick look. How close is Clark Avenue Park to Cleveland Public Library branch? Sean, do you happen to know?
No, but let me take a look. The nearest public library branch to Clark Fulton.
Cool. While you look at
I was gonna say, I know the South Branch is on, excuse me, sorry, is on Clark and Scranton, which is further east, east of West 25th Street. Then the Walls Branch is nearby. And then there's the Lorraine, I think it's branch. I'm trying to think of which one's the closest though. And then also in Ohio City, of course, there's another library branch.
The Marina, excuse me, put Fulton branch ? In the chat, so I'm thinking that might be it. Maybe that's a good opportunity for a walking tour from a library. Let's see, Sean, this one might be a good one for you, but David, if you want to chime in and I can share any input from my perspective, can you share what funding sources, routine and new, are available or coming for parks and related trails?
Well, specific to trails, I mean, we have an internal TPL fund that I'm really looking forward to tapping into. It's called the Equitable Communities Fund. When the RLP was announced, I think one of the first questions I got from residents was, how is this park aligned with the Red Line Greenway? And so I think that while we haven't talked a lot about that, I think that this opens up the conversation around connectivity and sort of what is the broader 10-minute walk goal aspiring to. Not only is it just about connecting residents to local park spaces, but it's really connecting park and recreation spaces to one another. So being able to provide access to a nearby greenway, which is, I believe, less than 3 miles from where the future park will be located, will be a huge challenge, one that we're really excited to sort of domino effect, if you will, and next step and start to thinking about how we can make that happen. And I'm really excited to work with some of the local stakeholders who are already starting to think about that challenge. So that's a great question.
Awesome. I'm not seeing a lot of other questions from the audience, so I'm going to dive into some of the questions that we have for you. I am going to ask David and Sean to help in. When I shared my screen, I can't see our hop-in view or the chat. So if you can read any comments that we get in the chat, I will do my very best to put those in our Jamboard. Additionally, I invite any of our participants, if you have some comments or questions or things that you'd like to share based on the question that we have up for the Jamboard, you can click the share audio and video button on your screen. We've got Brittany on the back end who can turn your camera on for us, and we can actually hear from you some of your comments. So we may also ask you, based on what you put in the chat, to chime in, or we may ask you to turn on your camera and elaborate if there's something that is particularly interesting. So with that, I'm going to pull up the board. Give me one quick second. And then if you guys can let me know when you can see that. Looks like it's up. All right, so our first question is, what do you think are the best qualities of current Cleveland parks and or recreation centers? And I'm going to quickly look in our poll here. Can I show results? So right now we have about 40% of our audience are residents, 30% are community partners, 20% are public employees, and 10% are other. About half are Cleveland residents, the rest are not, and about 10% actually want to be Cleveland residents. All of our audience lives within a half mile of a 10-minute walk, and they either get to their parks by walking, biking, or driving. All right, so going back to the Jamboard, any feedback from the audience? Thinking of Cleveland's best park qualities. Maybe David or Sean, could you share your feelings just to kind of kick things off, and hopefully we'll get some comments from our audience.
I'll let you dive in. I was actually responding to Ari's question on the chat. So go ahead, David.
I say I think one of the great qualities is really that proximity. I mean, Sean and Kristin shared some of that data of how much of the city is currently within a 10-minute walk of a park. I think that's a great asset. But similar to the library branch network, which has, a significant number of branches given the population of the city, there can come questions about like, well, what's the quality of the amenities? What are the resources available at each of those libraries? Do they have everything that we want? So I would just say, I think it's great that even in the polls here, I think 100% of the participants said they're within a 10-minute walk, which is really, really fabulous. But I think the focus then is on, filling in some of those gaps that do exist, and then also focusing on what are the amenities and what's the quality.
And Sean, thank you for replying to Ari's questions. Let's see here. Now I can see who's in the room, and I'm recognizing some names. I'm hoping we can get a little bit more feedback from some folks. Cleveland's best park, or Parks and Recreation Center's best qualities. Or, you know what, I'll invite you, feel free to type in the chat what's your favorite Cleveland park. You can throw that in there, but we may ask you to share, what it is that you like about it. Ooh, there we go. Thank you, Rachel. I think that's a big one.
At this time, I'd like to open up for an open panel discussion. Not too many questions in the chat. If you do have any, please go ahead. We still have
West Creek. Thank you, Alyssa.
But I will start it off with a question from Norm Schmidt, who asks.
All right. Thank you, Rachel. I'm seeing adult equipment and kid equipment. So I think those are definitely a big one, and a pool. So let me add some of those. All right. And Sean and David, please feel free to, if there's stuff that's coming in that I can't see, let me know. Okay. Let's see. Thank you, Rachel. I appreciate it. I hope some of our audience, and seems like they might be a little shy today, and understood we're right after lunch. Walking paths.
Yeah, I think you're doing well capturing the comments, Kristin. I saw this one about dogs or pets. That's a really really great consideration, because it's a thing that if you have a dog, it's something that makes you go for a walk frequently. Even if you don't feel like it, it's like, well, I need to for the dog. So it's a cool opportunity to draw people into the park space on a more regular basis.
Sure. There's some consistency, I think, here too, with some comments around adult and senior exercise. One of the things that is really talked about a lot is just the perception of safety and feeling safe in the park space. But one of the easiest ways to address that is by programming the space, but programming it in a manner that allows families to benefit and having intergenerational use happening. So again, when I talk about complementary use, and the fact that we're seeing investment happen at almost in a campus-like environment, potentially here in Clark Fulton, you have the opportunity to not just have programming cater to kids, but having it be a family experience where parents can go and keep a close watch on kids while they are doing their thing and sort of expanding their independence and playing on equipment designed for them, but then also having amenities that that parents and seniors can benefit from. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, David, Kristin.
No, I think what I was going to say is that feels like a good transition into our next question around what are your top priorities for Cleveland parks, one or two. So when you think of what's getting you to those parks, and ultimately what you're kind of accessing or using while you're there, you know, what are those top priorities that, you know, you want to make sure as we're moving forward and making those investments that we're looking at as well. And David, I'm going to actually use your comment as our first one for this, the personal use, and making sure it is, you know, meets everyone's needs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just say I really like Judy's comment there about being a trail ambassador for 13 years with the Metro Parks, and I think this goes back to that kind of Venn diagram I was showing earlier, where you consider the physical things, and that's important, right, for the design of a place. But that level of service, the personal dimension, so having people that are known and recognizable, that make you feel more comfortable, that you know that someone's there if you need help, even if you don't actually use it, knowing that it's there makes you feel more comfortable, and someone to talk to, like having a friendly face to welcome you, or is such an important dimension to like designing any environment. And I see a comment from Adrian. You know, full disclosure, that was one of my former students. So, hey, Adrian, good to see you here, landscape architecture student. So he made the point about being close to a park with a pool. And I think it's the case that Cleveland has the most public pools per capita for any city. Is that right? I don't know if I'm mistaken on that, but
I think that is correct.
Yeah. But the point there is, you know, were there any wild requests from children during the feedback sessions thus far? I think what I'd say is, I don't know, beyond like some wild request, I think it's useful to think about how parks in Cleveland can be more responsive to their local environment. And this is actually something that I know the city's already doing more so than in the past. So rather than having like one general template for a park that's the same across the city, you know, embedding design elements into each park that are locally based, you know, so it might be something to do with the local culture, maybe even the architecture design of the surrounding area, or, you know, if it's a place that has a significant number of kids or a school nearby, designing a playground environment or a landscape that has, you know, that distinctive local feel to it, I think is like a huge opportunity for the parks in Cleveland, maybe taking on some part of like an identity that distinguishes it from other parks. So we'll see. No, I'm excited to see, Adrian, what kids come up with, you know, going forward.
David, I'm trying to capture some of these.
Yeah.
I think just looking at the time, it might be about time to move on to our very last question. We are capturing the chat as well. It gets recorded. So thank you all. If we didn't get to put up on the Jamboard, I apologize. Yeah. But I'm going to move us on to our final question. Then we're going to get this closed out. Who should be engaged during the community outreach planning process or programming activities for parks and recreation centers? I think a very obvious one, of course, is our residents. So I think we're hoping to get some feedback from, you know, a little outside of those, of other stakeholders that should be engaged.
Yeah, so the question here is, you know, who do you think is kind of missing, you know, or who may be harder to reach or often overlooked in parks planning projects that should be clearly identified? We heard some comments along those lines already. Yeah, a lot of grassroots organization, Rachel's saying, they have trouble getting a spot at the table, right? So I think that's one of the great opportunities is there's a lot of groups that already have an affinity to parks. Maybe it's for advocacy, maybe it's environmental dimension, maybe it's cultural, but getting more involvement. That's right. And this is cool. The idea of the CSU working on a green book for Cleveland that's mapping African-American recreational history. Yeah, I think that's huge. Like making some of the history that's not broadly known, front and center, because then you get a deeper link into the past that then gives you a sense of pride. The place feels special. Yeah.
All right, if you don't mind, in the chat, maybe following up, do you know who's what department is maybe leading that effort around African American history? I'd love to learn a little bit more about that.
And I think it's also a good point in terms of like who's recognized in some of the parks. So if in some examples, like I think a Luke Easter Park, named after Luke Easter. So there's a statue in the park, but who are other individuals or even entities or groups that don't have the recognition that they really deserve in these park spaces. Like parks are such an important public environment for education and building that broad cultural knowledge of who are the figures that are worth knowing, that we should know better. So from public art installations to even the names of some of the parks could be one opportunity.
Looks like we may be getting some disconnect here with our chat. So for folks who are trying to type in, Elaine, I see your comment about Karush too. I'm not sure if there was a technical glitch here, but it looks like we're capturing your comments now.
Yep, I'm trying to keep up. I think I just want to be mindful of our time. I am going to, Elaine, I like that you were hopefully telling the other sessions about our great parks as well. I'm going to capture a couple more of these, but I just want to make sure I leave some space. The session will keep going for a couple extra minutes, but just to thank David and Sean for presenting with me today, and also just for being such awesome partners on this. The Office of Sustainability, City Planning, and TPL have been engaging for quite a while, and I feel like especially some of the things that David shared today are really starting to be the culmination of our efforts, and I think we're really going to start to see those on the ground and be able to implement them in our neighborhood. So very much looking forward to that. So with that, I just want to go ahead and close out the session. I encourage all of you to stick with us the rest of this afternoon. We've got 2 more rounds of sessions focused on circular economy, trees and green space, which has, of course, a lot of connections to this. I believe our land acquisition, I think, is after this as well. So, just lots of ways to keep connecting, and we encourage you to just stay connected with Sustainable Cleveland so we can keep you updated as we have progress. So with that, I will close this out. And again, thank you for joining, and thanks to David and Sean, and have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, appreciate it.